It was a Tuesday afternoon in late October, and I was cutting through the Rideau Centre on my way back from my dentist appointment on Spark Street. The leaves outside were already that deep amber color that only Ottawa does right, and I had my coat half buttoned because the wind off the river had a real bite to it. I was not planning to stop anywhere. I just wanted to get back to my car and drive home before the evening rush on the Queensway turned everything into a parking lot. That's when I saw my son. He was standing near the food court entrance, close to the Tim Hortons, with his back half turned to me. He was wearing the same gray jacket he'd had since before his wedding, the one with the small tear near the left pocket that he always said he'd get fixed. He was counting something in his hand. I slowed down. I thought maybe he'd dropped change, or was checking if he had enough for a coffee. But the way he was standing, shoulders curled inward, head down, it didn't look like someone counting change for a double-double. It looked like someone counting whether they could afford lunch. My son is 39 years old. He's an electrician with 15 years of experience. He earns good money. I walked up behind him and said his name. He spun around so fast he nearly dropped everything. And when I saw his face, I felt something cold settle in my chest that had nothing to do with the October wind. He looked exhausted. Not tired from work exhausted. The other kind. The kind that lives behind the eyes. I said, "Sweetheart, what are you doing here? Where's your truck?" He looked down at his hand, then back at me and said, "I took the bus." I said, "You took the bus from Barhaven? That's over an hour each way." He nodded and said something about the truck needing repairs. I said, "How long has it been in the shop?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It's not in the shop, Mum." I stood there in the middle of that food court with people moving around us on every side, and I looked at my son, my boy, who had helped me reshingle my roof 2 summers ago, who called me every Sunday without fail, who had coached his nephew's hockey team for 3 seasons, and I said very quietly, "Then where is it?" He looked away. He said, "She's been driving it." I said, "Your wife has been driving your truck?" He said, "Yes." I said, "What have you been driving?" He said, "Nothing." I asked him to find us somewhere to sit. We went to a corner table near the window, and over the next 40 minutes, my son told me things that I am still, to this day, struggling to fully absorb. "It had started gradually," he said. "That's always how it starts, isn't it? Small things." His wife, I'll call her Renata, had started handling the household finances about 2 years into their marriage, which had seemed reasonable at the time. She was organized. She had a system. My son is a practical man, not a paperwork man, and he'd been relieved to hand it over. His paychecks from the electrical contractor he worked for went into their joint account. He'd always had access to it. At first, then Renata's mother, I'll call her Vera, had moved in from Edmonton. Just temporarily, Renata said. Just until she got back on her feet. That was 14 months ago. Vera had never left. Within a few months of Vera arriving, the joint account was closed. Renata said they were opening a new one at a different bank, better interest rates, she said. My son signed the paperwork she put in front of him one evening after dinner without reading it carefully. He trusted her. The new account was in Renata's name only. His paychecks were redirected there through a direct deposit change she had arranged, telling him the old account had a monthly fee. I want you to let that sit for a moment. His earnings. Going into an account he could not access. When he asked Renata for money for gas, for lunch, for a new pair of work boots after his old ones cracked through, she gave him an allowance. That is the only word for it. $60 a week. For a grown man, a licensed electrician, a homeowner, $60. The house they lived in was a semi-detached in Barhaven that they had bought together in 2019, both names on the mortgage, both names on the deed, at least when they'd bought it. My son had not seen a mortgage statement in over a year. When he asked, Renata said she was handling it. When he asked to see the bank statements, she said he was being paranoid, that this was exactly the kind of controlling behavior that made her feel unsafe. She used that word, unsafe. About him asking to see his own financial documents. He had stopped asking. His truck, a 2020 Ford F-150 that he had bought himself before the marriage, that was registered in his name Renata, had started driving after telling him the insurance was cheaper if she was the primary driver. He had believed her. After a while she had simply kept it, and he had gotten used to taking the bus to job sites, borrowing a coworker's vehicle when he needed to haul equipment, saying nothing. I said, "How long?" He said, 8 months. I said, 8 months you've been taking the bus to work sites in January? In Ottawa? He looked at the table. I said, "Why didn't you tell me?" And this is the part that broke my heart completely. He said, "Because every time I thought about calling you, Vera would be somewhere in the house, and Renata had said that you were never going to accept her, that you were looking for reasons to interfere, and I didn't want to make things worse. She said if I went to you, it would prove that I wasn't committed to the marriage." My son had been made to feel that calling his own mother was a betrayal. I reached across that table and I put my hand over his and I said, "Listen to me. I'm not going to tell you what to do. But I am going to ask you one question, and I need you to answer it honestly. Are you happy?" He didn't answer for a long time. Then he shook his head. I said, "Then let me help you. That's all I'm asking." I drove him home that afternoon back to the house in Barhaven because he had a tool belt and some equipment he'd left there that he needed for a job the next morning. Renata's car and his truck were both in the driveway. Vera's curtain moved in the front window when we pulled up. My son went inside to get his things. I sat in my car and I looked at that house, both their names on the deed. I made note of that. That evening I sat at my kitchen table in Canada and I thought very carefully about what I was going to do. I am 63 years old. I worked for 31 years in HR management for the federal government. I know how documentation works. I know how processes work. And I know that when someone has spent months gradually removing another person's access to their own money, their own vehicle, and their own family, it does not happen by accident. It is a system, and systems leave evidence. The next morning I called my son's direct deposit bank not to access any account. I want to be clear about that, but to ask a general question about how a direct deposit redirect is set up and what documentation it requires. The information I received was useful. Then I called a family lawyer here in Ottawa. I am not going to name her, but she has been practicing family and financial law for over 20 years, and she had heard this type of situation before. She used a specific term for what I was describing: coercive financial control. In Ontario and across Canada, family courts take this very seriously, particularly when there is shared property involved. I asked her what we needed. She said, documentation, bank statements if he can obtain them, mortgage records, proof of vehicle ownership and registration, and anything that establishes a pattern. My son, it turned out, had kept more than he realized. He had old text messages on his phone where Renata had explicitly told him she was managing the money and that he didn't need access. He had emails from his contractor employer confirming his salary over $94,000 the previous year. He had the original mortgage documents from 2019 showing both names. He had the vehicle registration for the truck in his name alone. And he had something else he hadn't thought was significant, a voicemail from Vera, left 3 months ago, in which she said very clearly that if he ever thought about running to his mother or a lawyer, Renata would make sure he regretted it. I want you to hear that again. A voicemail threatening him against seeking legal help. My lawyer called that quite useful. We moved carefully, and we moved quietly. My son continued going to work, continued living in the house, said nothing to Renata about what we were doing. I know some people watching this will say he should have left immediately. I understand that feeling. But leaving a shared property without legal advice can complicate property claims, and our lawyer was very clear that staying put in the short term while we built our case was the right approach. This was not weakness, this was strategy. Over the following 3 weeks, my son gathered what he could. He opened a new personal account at a different bank, just his name, and arranged with his employer to split his direct deposit going forward, with the new portion going somewhere Renata had no access to. This was entirely legal. His money, his choice. He also, on our lawyer's advice, began quietly documenting the daily situation. Not secretly recording conversations that has its own legal complications in Ontario, but keeping a written log. Date, time, what was said or withheld. The $60 allowance. The truck. The request to see bank statements that were refused. Every entry dated, detailed, saved in an email he sent to himself. I will tell you the moment I knew we had everything we needed. I was parked down the street from their house on a Saturday morning. I know how that sounds, but my lawyer had suggested that if the truck was being used without my son's consent, a time-stamped photo of the registration, versus who was driving it could be relevant. And I watched Vera come out of the house, get into my son's F-150, and drive away. His truck, registered in his name, without his knowledge or permission that day. I photographed the plate and the time. I sent it to our lawyer. She wrote back within the hour. She said, "Good. We're ready to move." We arranged a meeting. Not a confrontation at the house. I am 63, not foolish, but a formal meeting at our lawyer's office on Elgin Street, with Renata notified in writing that the meeting concerned shared property and financial matters related to the marriage. She had the right to bring her own lawyer. She brought Vera instead. That told our lawyer everything she needed to know about how this household operated. I will not describe the entire meeting because some of what was said is private to my son, but I will tell you the key moments. When our lawyer laid out the documented salary versus the $60 weekly allowance, Renata said my son had agreed to it. Our lawyer asked for that agreement in writing. There was none. When our lawyer raised the truck registration and the photographs of Vera driving it without documented permission, Vera began to speak. Our lawyer addressed her directly and said, "You are not a party to this marriage or this property. You are here as a guest. I would ask you to allow the relevant parties to speak." Vera did not say much after that. When our lawyer raised the voicemail and played it, on speaker, in that office Renata went pale. The voicemail where Vera threatened my son against seeking legal help constituted, our lawyer explained, potential witness intimidation. She recommended that my son's employer's legal department be made aware, as my son worked on federally regulated job sites where such matters have specific reporting implications. She did not make this as a threat. She made it as information. The mood in that room changed. What followed was not a dramatic courtroom scene. It was paperwork, and it took several weeks, and it was exhausting and expensive, and there were nights my son stayed at my house in Canada and barely slept. But here is what was agreed to, with both lawyers present and everything signed. Renata would restore my son's full access to the joint finances until the formal separation agreement was completed. She would return sole use of the truck to my son immediately, within 48 hours of signing. She would provide full mortgage statements for the past 14 months. And Vera would vacate the shared marital home within 30 days, as she had no legal tenancy agreement and was there at Renata's invitation, which my son had never formally consented to in writing. My son did not get everything he deserved. The legal process is slow and settlement is imperfect, and yes, there are people watching this who will feel that Renata and Vera faced no real consequences for what they did. I felt that way too, on many nights. The family lawyer was honest with me about the limits of what civil family law can accomplish compared to what justice feels like. But here is what is true today. My son is living in a rental apartment in Gloucester that he chose himself. He is driving his own truck. His paycheck goes into his own account. He is sleeping, finally, like a person who has set down something very heavy. He is coaching his nephew's hockey team again. He called me last Sunday, same as always. His voice sounded like him again. Last month he came over and we raked the leaves in my backyard in Canada together, and when we came inside for tea he sat at my kitchen table and said, "Mum, I'm sorry I didn't call sooner." I said, "You called when you were ready. That's enough." He said, "I kept thinking there was something wrong with me. That I was the problem." I said, "That's what they wanted you to think." He was quiet for a bit, and then he said, "What made you follow up that day at the Rideau Centre?" I didn't say very much. I said, "You were counting coins for lunch. You, who always brought leftovers in a container because you said food court prices were highway robbery." He laughed. First real laugh I'd heard from him in longer than I could say. If you are watching this and something in this story feels familiar, I want to say one thing. Financial control is abuse. It does not require raised voices or broken furniture. It is quiet, and it is slow, and it is designed to make the person experiencing it feel like they are the unreasonable one. If someone you love has stopped talking about money, stopped mentioning their paycheck, started seeming apologetic about small purchases, pay attention. Ask a simple question. Sit with them in a food court and listen. That is all I did. I just listened, and then I made some phone calls. My son is going to be all right. I know that now.